Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Braeburn Whisky Podcask. I'm here with my co-host, Mihai.
Hello.
Hello, Mihai.
Hi, Jacob.
So what we're going to talk about, we'll talk about whiskey, obviously, but we're going to talk about whiskey being the global brand that it is.
Yeah.
The fact that everybody associates whiskey with this sort of fine spirit, more so than any other spirit out there.
High-end drink.
High-end drink.
Something associated with high status. You find it everywhere.
You find it everywhere.
In your
It's
airports,
representative of Scottish culture, a global ambassador for Scotland, and not a bad drink either, by the way.
No.
But I think it's fair to say that whiskey is a global product from this little small part of Europe, and we're interested to know why that might be.
Yeah, basically how we got here.
How did we get here? Why do people drink so much Scotch whisky? Why is it regarded as sort of this premium product, as it has been for over 100 years? And how did we end up here? So we're going to talk about that, aren't we, Mihai?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, there's quite a lot of factors of how we got here, but I think we're going to focus for this podcast on three characters.
Three characters.
Basically, the good, the bad,
and
the whiskey.
Stories about
and
whiskey.
The whiskey. So it all starts with Robert and Walter Patterson. So
Robert and Walter
Patterson,
the
Patterson brothers.
Of Patterson whiskey crash fame.
Yeah.
Robert and Walter. So they were originally dairy farmers.
Correct.
Dairy farmers from Edinburgh who decided that there wasn't enough money in milk. And so they turned their attentions to whiskey, and they were very successful. Yeah, they were very successful as whiskey entrepreneurs
for a period of time.
Yeah, during the late Victorian era. Yeah. Famous, there was two: Morning Dew and Royal Gordon.
Royal Gordon. They were their first two brands.
In 1889, I believe that they had these brands. So why are we talking about the Patterson brothers? Well, there's a legendary story within the whiskey industry of the great whiskey crash, more specifically the Patterson brothers crash. These two guys are attributed with bringing the entire whiskey industry down during the late 1800s, early 1900s. And as you said, they were Robert and Walter Patterson, formerly dairy farmers that turned their hand to blending whiskey.
Correct.
Initially, they were blending whiskey. They made that much money out of blending whiskey that they decided to distill whiskey as well. Yeah. Turns out, what were they blending?
They were blending all sorts of stuff.
all sorts of
stuff. They were selling their blends as premium, high-end.
Glenlivet.
Yeah.
Premium
high-end whiskey, and then it turns out there was actually very cheap liquid in there.
Yeah, cheap Irish grain whiskey apparently.
Yeah.
That they were blending with a teaspoon of fine Scottish malt whiskey. So they were basically charlatans. Yeah. But that was only one of their tricks. I mean, they're more famous for their financial. What would you call it? Delinquency, wizardry. You could describe it as that. So they were doing incredibly well, and subsequently floated their company on the stock exchange for the princely sum of, I think it was £100,000 was the capital that they raised as a result of their market float.
Yeah.
Apparently,
which in those ages we're talking about the late 1800s.
Yeah, I think it was something.
It was a lot of money.
Significant amount of money. Yeah, it was like sort of one of the biggest market floats of the era. But significantly overvalued, it turns out, this flotation. But the reason that they made such a positive contribution to whiskey was the fact that they were actually marketing geniuses.
Correct.
And there are some interesting stories about how they went about marketing their whiskey. Yeah. I think my favourite is probably the parrot story.
The African
greys.
Yeah. So the story with that, basically they did a lot of stuff. The story with the Patterson brothers, I think we should take it a little bit further back to the beginning of kind of how they got to the parrot stories.
Go ahead.
Just because basically they saw something unique that nobody else saw. In those times, they started obviously with whiskey, and then at that point, whiskey was such a strong market that the banks were giving out loans. Like it was such in such a strong position, so they just explored that more and more and more. And what they
loans?
did.
Credit, debt.
Credits, exactly.
Yeah, they were big on debt, weren't they?
They were taking a lot.
Things.
Yeah, they were taking a lot. What you mentioned there with the stock, they were basically buying their own shares multiple times to inflate the price.
Yes, and this was all discovered post float. So what they were in essence doing to make their company look more valuable than it in reality was, so they could borrow more and more money against the company, was they were selling their whiskey stock, subsequently buying it back at an inflated price, so it appeared on their balance book as a far more valuable asset than in reality it was, and they were using that as collateral to borrow more money. Did you not tell me a story? Did you not mention something earlier about that, or maybe I heard it somewhere else? They borrowed £100,000 or some sort of pretty significant figure, and half of it went straight into Walter's pocket.
Yeah, most of it. And they were paying dividends.
No, they were paying dividends. Ponzi scheme they were running as well. Basically. So they were, after post-flotation, they were to keep their investors obviously happy. Sounds like a familiar story somehow, this. I'm thinking mad off. They were paying dividends not from revenue, but from the capital position that the company had. So
and
in
the
effect,
capital invested by other.
So they were just borrowing, paying dividends, borrowing some more. So obviously, at some point, that particular business model is going to come crashing down.
Correct.
It's very much works when you're in an expanding industry, but any sort of sign of difficulty, you're going to get caught out, as did the Patterson brothers.
Correct. But they were doing really well. Like they were listed on the London Stock Exchange.
Yeah, exactly.
They had 150 salespeople that were basically going around the UK and signing up bars, restaurants, and pubs to basically sell their whiskey. And that's how they grew.
Well, this is the interesting point. This is why we reluctantly have some, what would you call it, admiration for the Patterson brothers in terms of their marketing skills. And yes, they had this massive network of salespeople. What was it,
150.
150, and they used to call them travellers.
Travellers, yeah.
Travelling salesmen, but 150, which is sort of like 3 times or 4 times as many as their nearest competitor, and they were relatively small fry.
Well, just think about their biggest competitor was DCL, which today is Diageo, basically. It was a huge company, but it wasn't at the scale that it is now. And to have 150 salespeople for you, like working for your company, that was a really, really big deal.
Yeah, and given the way that they were cooking the books, and I suppose that sort of the cost associated with these salespeople wasn't really an issue for them, was it? But the genius of their marketing is why we mentioned them, not because they managed to single-handedly destroy the whiskey industry in the late 1900s, but again, African parrots.
Yeah,
Tell us about the African parrots, mate.
They were all about whiskey marketing and branding, basically. And what they did is they bought how many parrots?
500.
500
African grey parrots.
500 African grey parrots. These are big, intelligent birds that you can essentially teach how to speak. And what they did is they were gifting these parrots through their salespeople, exactly, to bars, to restaurants, grocers, to pub owners, whatever it is. And they were having the parrots inside those places, and whenever somebody would come in, they were being taught to say...
Well, they were trained to say...
To say, buy Patterson whiskey.
Buy Patterson's whiskey.
Obviously, the parrot voice, which I'm not going to do.
I'm sure if you hear that... Show us your parrot voice, mate. I can't do it. But I'm sure if you hear that enough, you're probably going to buy some Patterson's whiskey. Yeah. So there was 2, buy Patterson's whiskey, and Patterson's whiskey is the best. 500 parrots. I mean, I don't know if there's any sort of... there's an ROI associated with that. It's not one that I've seen, but you would imagine that was probably even just novelty factor that you'd have got a degree of success from.
Well, it was branding. If you hear that, more times than you should, or if you hear it constantly, it's going to be stuck in your mind. When you're going to see Patterson's whiskey, you're going to pick it up.
Well, how often do you walk into a greengrocer's and the parrot's giving you instructions on what you're supposed to buy? Not often.
Not very often.
They actually, in 1897, they spent £20,000 on their marketing, an outrageous figure at the time. And the following year, they spent £60,000 on their marketing, which is the equivalent today of over £5 million. And nobody else was doing
incredible.
it. Yeah, it's absolutely, again, if you're cooking the books, who cares?
You can do whatever you want.
You can do whatever you like, can't you? So they were regarded as pioneers in the advertising industry, in whiskey, and just generally they were pioneers of advertising. And obviously they made a massive contribution to the global profile, certainly the profile of Scotch whisky across the United Kingdom, but globally as well.
They were also known in the industry, and like everybody that was basically drinking whiskey back then was knowing them as very flashy, very extravagant, and a little bit over the top at some point.
I mean, 500 grey African parrots.
That's just one example, but they did a lot of stuff. Like Walter. Basically thought, okay, Paterson's brothers, we're not big enough. Let's buy some more distilleries, or let's buy distilleries. So they actually ended up buying Braeburn. They purchased half of Glenfarclas, and they also bought Altmore. And then Robert said, hold on a second, if you're doing this, let me do something else. And they just basically built a really big, flashy office that everybody knew about.
Yes.
And I think it was in Leith,
the big marble-fronted offices.
Correct.
Well, some of those buildings still survive today. Pretty impressive stuff.
Yeah. But people were knowing them as, being these, they'd have no regard for how much they're spending. They're going to just show off with whatever they've got. And there was the train incident.
The trains, of course. So they were getting trains from Galashiels to Edinburgh. Yeah. And they would purposely turn up a couple of minutes late for the train. Get very annoyed about that, and then insist that they're provided with their own private train, which at a cost, well, I know this, £5 and 1 shilling per mile. But they briefed the press beforehand as well. So everybody was there to see the Flash Patterson brothers jump on their own privately hired train to get into Edinburgh for their important business meetings.
Yeah. But this is all a show to basically portray their brand as being this premium whiskey, look at the owners, we can do whatever we want, this is our power basically in the market. And then people were buying into that. They didn't really know what they were drinking.
More interestingly was the fact that other smaller companies around the Patterson brothers, as opposed to sort of that, trying to carry out any kind of due diligence on the financial health of these two brothers and their companies, they were all of the sort of similar attitude: get fast, quick, get rich fast, or get rich quick, one of the two. And so there was a bit of a blind eye turned to what their extravagances, and clearly the value of their assets and the whiskey that they had not really being in correlating at all with the sort of this what would you call it? This billionaire lifestyle that the two of them were living together.
And that's how basically they got to bankruptcy in the end. So where they defaulted on, I think it was a £30,000 loan. Maybe it would have been.
I think it was.
It was to DCL.
That's right.
So they were lending money from DCL, and they couldn't pay it back at some point, obviously. With that lifestyle,
the demand for whiskey had sort of dried up a little bit, and they could no longer do their tricks, and they got. I think so. I've got it written down here. The 5th of December, 1898. Their stock plummeted by 55%. And later the Clydesdale Bank refused to extend the company's credit, leading to the start of formal liquidation. And there was a £500,000 hole that they basically just spent on flash cars and the like, trains obviously.
And that's basically when everybody discovered that they were cooking the books.
But again, okay. We know that they were crooks. We know that they were cooking the books. But again, the reason we're talking about them isn't so much about the Patterson crash, but it's about their contribution towards creating this whiskey as a global brand. And one thing that I picked up on, one thing they were big on was exploiting empire, and what was the sort of the flavour of the day, the military, the empire.
Right.
And I actually had it
We don't
printed
have the
out
ad,
here,
yeah.
and I may have left it downstairs. Oh, here we go. Here's
Did
one
will
of
edit
them.
it in the video.
So here's one. Patterson's Whisky, the whiskey par excellence. Acknowledged this is great, acknowledged to be perfection by all impartial men. I mean, that's a pretty strong accolade.
And then obviously you've got the picture of the parrot, and
Picture of the parrot,
one of the
yeah,
parrots
can we
says
show that?
speaks
There's the
for
parrot,
itself.
look. There's the parrots. That is probably one of the original parrots. Fortunately, we can't hear him speak. That the public appreciate a really sound, wholesome drink is proved by the enormous increase year by year in the sale of Patterson's, and lovers of a genuine Scotch brand who have not yet made its acquaintance should give this, the king of whiskies, an early trial. They will be delighted with its rich, full, cream-like flavour. This is an absolute purity, which is a bit of a stretch given that they were just basically using cheap Irish grain whiskey.
That's it. I forgot that they were actually entitling themselves
Try it.
as the king of whiskies, right?
Yeah, the king of whiskies. Try it. It speaks for itself. Sold everywhere. I love that.
Yeah.
Sold everywhere. You can find it And then I spotted another one of theirs, which was this sort of military that they
With the
tapped
battalion
into
and,
very, very successfully. But there was a sort of it's a row of cannons, and you've got all the soldiers there, and underneath it says, "Big Boom." And well, the irony wasn't lost on me, given that they subsequently followed by a big bust. But yeah, they are widely acknowledged as being one of the pioneers, not only just advertising generally, but certainly take some credit for
the way they presented whiskey, for the way that they kind of revolutionized
whiskey.
The integration in the market and the way that people were looking at it. Obviously, they were doing it in a sense with, bad intentions as such, but
they were just they were just criminals.
Yeah,
there was nothing. They were criminals. They didn't they didn't get into it and had problems and subsequently they were out and out criminals.
Well, they were arrested.
Right from so. They were subsequently, once these proceedings were underway, because the banks, Clydesdale Bank had refused them their credit.
Yes.
So the wheels are starting to come off quite quickly. The actual demand for whiskey was starting to drop off anyway. And it turns out that there's massive amounts of inventory. I can't remember the figure. I think it went up from 3 million gallons of whiskey to the following year over 12 point something million gallons of whiskey in bond maturing in Scotland. And the fact of the matter was that actually consumption of whiskey at that point was declining slightly.
Absolutely.
Now, they seized an opportunity. We should mention this quite quickly. What was it that enabled the Pattersons? Well, it's the great blight of the grape in Europe.
Yes.
Cognac.
Cognac
no
and
longer
wine.
being available. Wine, they were the French and the sort of traditional, cognac was regarded as this sort of fine, high-end spirit, which now whiskey is taking the mantle in that regard. But they jumped in and filled the void.
Yeah.
But they were there.
That was the opportunity, basically.
That was the opportunity. Yeah. They were there purely for the money.
Correct.
And as clever as they were, they got caught out in the end. And the two of them were subsequently tried and convicted of fraud and embezzlement in 1901. And Robert was jailed for 18 months, and his brother Walter, I believe, got 9 months.
9 months.
In Perth General Prison.
Yeah. Well, there was a big winner.
There was a big winner. There was a big winner. And that winner being?
DCL.
DCL.
DCL basically went in and bought a lot of distilleries for a fraction of the price that they would have been willing to pay back then, because there was, back in those days, there were about 150 distilleries operating in Scotland, and then once the crash happened, there were about 15 or 20 operational.
I think it was 15.
I can't remember which one it was that they just finished. Glenelgin. So they finished building the distillery, and literally a year or two after, they had to shut doors.
Within 5 months.
Oh, within 5 months.
Within 5 months of Glenelgin opening its doors, it was closed again. Yeah. And they talk about the Great Patterson crash. They take a lot of responsibilities, but clearly they can't take sole responsibility for bringing the entire industry down. Everybody got a little bit greedy. Everybody was producing more whiskey than was being consumed, which is why you ended up with this sort of, so much stock sat in warehouses. And there was this far-reaching effect. You mentioned there the distilleries, but so many businesses, creditors. I think there was 10 companies that were directly sort of trading with them. Immediately, they went down. And yeah, it had a massive attack on a massive consequence, obviously, the entire Scotch whisky industry. And somebody at that time uncannily predicted that no new distilleries would be built in Scotland for 50 years, which is a fairly bold prediction to make, and he was right. Spot on.
Yeah, he was
and
right.
In
what was his name?
I've got here Doug.
Doug.
So, yeah, Doug.
I've heard of him.
Doug. So Doug.
Thanks for that, Jacob.
Doug's a genius. Doug was right. And do you recall the name of the distillery that was built post Patterson crash in 1949?
Tullibardine.
Tullibardine. Constructed in 1949. That was the first distillery to be built post Patterson crash. And obviously we're in far better health than we were during those days. But other people benefited from it. You mentioned there DCL, Distiller Company Limited. They were able to buy up all of this stock at a massive discount price, and
it's part of why Diageo is the size that they are now.
So I should point out that DCL subsequently became Diageo. So. Yes, the Patterson brothers, crooked as they were, did actually make some. Well, you probably wouldn't want to be in the whiskey industry about the 1900s when it's all falling apart. But their legacy, to some extent, there is a bit of a positive legacy there. They did make a genuine contribution to the sort of global nature of whiskey. And we wouldn't have the Parrot stories to talk about, would we, if it wasn't for the Patterson brothers? That's one of my favourite stories.
They did leave something behind, right?
They did. They left us with a legacy, and then going on to who benefited from it brings us to another pioneer in the industry. Two brothers, but it was a family business. Yeah. Two brothers, but one particular.
One of them
brother.
more influential than the other.
Yeah.
In terms of this story and how he promoted whiskey, and that's Tommy Dewar.
So Thomas Dewar, son of John Dewar Senior, who was responsible for the forming of the Dewar's Company, whiskey company.
Founded the company in 1846.
1846, and when he passed away, he subsequently left the business to his two sons, John Jr. and Thomas, aka Tommy Dewar, Whiskey Tommy, the first whiskey baron.
Yes.
First ever whiskey baron. So he was famous for his marketing techniques, which were considered quite radical and quite described by Bruce Lockhart as a born salesman, witty, dapper, genial, and endowed with volcanic energy. He was also a bit of a racist, by the way, that I've spotted when I was reading his book.
Well, you picked up on that.
I think anybody that read that book would have definitely picked up on it, given his choice of colourful language. But we'll put that down to the age. And as you said, he was famous for his trip around the world.
Yeah, his marketing techniques, essentially, he was basically he became one of these pioneers in the way that you advertise whiskey and you promote whiskey. And he got to a point where he traveled for 2 years across the world, visiting 26 countries, basically selling whiskey and promoting Dewar's. They were already doing really well in England and in the UK, but Dewar's as a company.
Well, he was sent to London, wasn't he, by his father?
Correct.
To develop the brand.
He started working at 17 years of age.
Yeah. And so they sent him off down to London to make London.
Yes.
To further promote the family brand. And I think, if I read the story correctly, he was supposed to meet two contacts down there that were going to make introductions for him and help him. And one of them was dead. And the other one had gone bankrupt. Yeah, so that didn't really work out. But being this guy, Tommy Dewar, he sounds like a real sort of well, bon vivant and raconteur. See, two words there. You like those words, don't you?
Yeah, I'm gonna
Raconteur
write
and
them
bon
down.
vivant. But he was clearly very comfortable in socials. You know, he people loved Tommy Dewar essentially. And so he's very, very capable of building his own network. I think he became best friends with Thomas Lipton, the
Yes,
tea mogul.
and he also worked with Thomas Edison at some point. We'll touch on that story.
Touch on that. So, okay, so first of all, he's sent off to London by his father to build the brand in the UK. And there's a famous story about him attending the Brewers Fair.
The Brewers Fair.
Now,
yeah.
I've seen the Brewers Fair in London and the Brewers Fair in Birmingham. I think it was a Brewers Fair in Birmingham, but the Brewers Fair, and he turned up with a bagpiper in the full sort of regalia, and they didn't appreciate it.
No.
And being as smart as Tommy was, his sort of his attitude was
No bad marketing is no bad publicity is bad marketing, and he was a firm believer that if you don't advertise,
there was no marketing is bad marketing.
No marketing is bad.
No marketing is bad marketing.
No publicity is bad publicity.
Is it? Okay.
Basically, people were talking
Same
about
thing, yeah.
people were talking about Dewars, and they were talking about what he's doing. He didn't care if he offended people. He didn't care if he was annoying people. Like at the Brewers exhibition, people were annoyed at the bagpiper being very, very loud, and they were asking him to
set it up,
tell him to stop, and he was saying
well,
no.
he recognised it, didn't
Yeah.
he? He recognised, oh, okay, so suddenly people are paying attention
Yeah.
to my stand now.
Exactly.
So we'll keep that bagpiper going, thank you very much. They subsequently called the police. The police arrived, and they told him, look, you know, there's no law against it, and I'm going to continue to keep playing. And then the press turned up because everybody was getting really, really sort of aggravated about it. The press turned up, as you said, fantastic publicity for Tommy Dewar.
He was
and his family brand.
Disruptor marketeer. Is that how you say it? Disruptor marketeer.
Disruptive, yeah.
He was doing like untraditional stunts or untraditional techniques to basically promote his whiskey.
So he went off to, as you pointed out, he went on his travels, and he travelled to 26 countries.
Yes.
Over 2 years, and whilst he travelled, I think he recruited globally 32
sales agents,
new agents for his whiskey.
Yeah.
And I think the most exciting period of that whole journey was to the US.
Yes.
And there was a story whilst he was on the boats as well, whilst talking about him getting to the US. I'm sure you're going to mention that. I've just stolen your thunder. But he, every now and then, would throw a bottle.
The bottles, yes.
A bottle with a message in it.
Yeah. He would throw the bottles overboard, basically a small message inside the bottle saying, whoever finds this bottle is entitled to a case of Dewar's. And some of those bottles were found, and obviously people were talking about it and talking about this, you know, marketing stand, PR stand, whatever you want to call it.
The local press, it's a great story of the local press. Somebody found a bottle on the beach, they opened it up, and there was a promise there from John Dewar that if you send this to us, we will send you a case of finest Dewar's whiskey. And their attitude was, that's fine, you know, for the amount of publicity we get for this one case.
It cost them nothing.
It's absolute genius.
Well, they were
literally genius.
They spent an approximate, in today's money, about 500,000, £500,000 on that 2-year trip, basically sailing around the world promoting whiskey. Like they literally went everywhere. The Americans.
So the book is called Ramble Round the Globe. For those of you that care to read it,
want to read it.
I should give one caveat. There's some very colourful language in there that personally I found a little bit offensive, but there you go. Fortunately, I wasn't around in the 1900s. But he did do an excellent job of creating what is now a global brand, not only Dewar's. I mean, to this day, he went to the US, and to this day, this particular bottle of whiskey, well, not this particular one, in fact, we've got some funky version here, haven't we? We've got the apple spirit cask finish, French smooth, aged 8 years, French smooth, which I must confess is a new one. I quite like it. So Calvados cask finish, is that right, Billy?
That is correct, yeah.
Calvados cask finish, yes. I of all the blends, I'm a big fan of this one. But that still, to this day, is the biggest selling brand in the US.
Yeah.
And that's 120 years later.
Well, what Tommy was doing as well, that nobody else was doing in the industry. He was signing up brewers to a lot of awards and a lot of competitions where they were actually
You
winning.
mean he was sponsoring?
No, he was signing up the brand. So he was entering Stewart's as a company, as a blending, producer to all of these competitions, and they kept getting awards, getting medals, and that just fortified kind of the brand there for them. It wasn't just marketing tricks and stunts and whatnot, but they actually had a good product that people were enjoying it.
That's key.
And
it's a good product.
It was,
especially when you compare it to what the Parsons brothers were turning out at the time.
But what he also did, I think it's worth mentioning, when they went to the US, they had a little sponsorship, if I can call it like that. It wasn't that, but they had Dewar's cases in the White House.
Right. Well, there was the story about how he gifted 2 casks to two presidents there, and the second one that he gifted a cask of whiskey to was during Prohibition, wasn't it?
Yes.
So there's all kinds of controversy. Harrison, it was. Was it Benjamin Harrison? Which was fantastic. Again, pure genius. The whole country's sort of embroiled in this battle with Prohibition. Yeah. So what does he do? He gives the president a cask of whiskey. And the other thing was as well, they were quite protectionist. So they weren't really I don't know if it's still the case today, but they weren't supposed to be consuming non-American produced products in the White House. Yeah. So you've got Prohibition.
Let alone alcohol when it's Prohibition.
So he just says, well, why don't you take a cask of whiskey? So again, he got a lot of publicity from that. Yeah. You might describe it as negative publicity, but here we are today, 120 plus years later.
Biggest brands in the world. Another thing that basically took the brand to a completely different level was the Royal Warrant. And that was in 1893, Queen Victoria.
Yeah,
the same year. In 1893, basically, Queen Victoria gave them the Royal Warrant for Dewar's as a blend, and they were one of the first ones to actually receive that award. You've got Royal Lochnagar and you've got Royal Brackla as well, being single malts distilleries that have the Royal Warrant, but this just took them to the next level.
I think one of the key things about Tommy Dewar, the first whiskey baron, was he's clearly, here we go, a born salesman, witty, dapper, and endowed with a volcanic energy, and that's clearly been a great tool for him, because it says here, and I'm just reading here, so Tommy numbered the Prince of Wales, the future King of England, Edward the Seventh, among his friends, along with Thomas Lipton, the tea baron. Can you imagine a whiskey and a tea baron? Who were pretty much best friends, and he'd done a similar thing with tea, similar to what Tommy had done with whiskey. They travelled and sailed together, and interestingly, there was 3 motor vehicles registered in England at that time. Only 3. One of them was owned by the King, the other was owned by Thomas Lipton, and the other was owned by
Tommy Dewar.
Benzes as well, no less, or T-Tom and Whiskey Tom, as they were both known, original names.
Interesting.
And then they went on to build distilleries of their own.
Yeah.
They would have, what was it? Aberfeldy was their main one, wasn't it? And the Tullymet, I think, was the first distillery they had.
I think Aberfeldy was the first one.
No, I think Tullymet was the first one, and then they
built Aberfeldy to basically keep up with the supply, with the demand.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the global fame kind of caught up with them. Was that still in the late 1800s? Yeah.
Yeah. I think they started building. Aberfeldy in sort of 1893 or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it took 5 years to build. So I think it was being built from 1893.
Between 1896 and 1898, they built Aberfeldy, exactly, and that was essentially to keep up with demand. But that global demand came from obviously all his awards, the Royal Warrant, the tour around the world, But he also did something unique that hasn't been done until he actually did it.
Of course,
with Thomas Edison.
You're so excited.
I'm so excited. Yeah, just imagine working with him. They basically created the first ever filmed advertising.
That's right.
And that was in 1898.
Have you seen this advert?
Well, we watched it together.
It's super weird. I mean, essentially the premise is, so it's from what I could understand, it's somebody enjoying this fine Scotch whiskey, fine Scotch spirit, and Thomas, unlike the Patterson brothers, you know, he didn't change the name of the company, for example. It remained John Duran family, so he wasn't about putting himself in the frame. It wasn't a vanity for him, and he really had this, you know, affinity belief that it is about the ancestors and the history and other things that, to its credit, we hold dear today. And one of the key reasons I think that whiskey is held in such high regard as a spirit relative to rum and gin and vodka and what have you. But he basically, this advert is, there's somebody drinking and there are pictures on the wall of his ancestors, and whilst he's taking a dram of this sweet Dewar's white label blend, I couldn't recommend. I mean, please watch it. It's absolutely bonkers. So they all jump out of the pictures, but I would love to meet these guys. What? I would love to meet the guys that did that strange dance as ghosts and the odd jigs that they were doing. I mean, it was a bit creepy, if I'm honest.
Because the premise of the advert was something to do with the ghosts of Scotch, or the ghosts of
our ancestors past. Yeah,
ancestors past. That's
and you know, the spirit is in some way connected to our ancestors in the past, and that's what he was trying to. I was just trying to demonstrate.
What did he do with the advert? He projected it on a New York building.
That's right. Projected. I mean, he's phenomenal. He exactly, and apparently it immediately caught all the traffic, horse and carts, I would imagine at the time, all came to a grinding halt, and everybody watched this, the first ever TV advert of some very strange-looking gentlemen in traditional Scottish attire, jumping out of what are supposed to be picture frames and doing a quite wild dance.
Yeah, but a lot of people saw it.
Yeah, no.
They knew what yours was now.
Absolutely phenomenal stuff. And then there's another story about, Prohibition. And we touched on this in a previous podcast, and Prohibition and that's impact on the Scottish whisky industry. Now, he counted amongst his friends Father Kennedy.
Yes.
And Father Kennedy was renowned for having strong links with the Scottish whisky industry. And nobody's suggesting that he broke the law in any way, shape or form, but he was definitely preparing for the times of post-Prohibition. But Tommy did a very good job of positioning Scotch whisky as a superior alternative to the Irish whisky, which is a dram of choice. So he took advantage of that. And there's a few different stories. So he was there during Prohibition, and he's obviously given this cast to Harrison, and he wanted to buy some whiskey for himself, and he couldn't buy any whiskey, so he got directed to various places, and he ended up in this particular place, and he says to the guy, "Do you sell whiskey?" And the guy says, "Are you sick, or mister, or have you got a medical certificate?" Which clearly he didn't. He said, "Then I can't do it. See, it's Prohibition state, so I can't sell it you. But if you've got cholera, I've got a mixture that'll fix that right up for you." And so, I'm sure they had this cholera conversation, and Tommy decided maybe he did have a touch of the choleras. And I'll paraphrase. "To my great astonishment, I received a very familiar bottle, labelled on one side, cholera mixture. A wine glassful to be taken once every 2 hours." Every 2 hours.
That was so whatever you.
A wine glass. A wine glass. One of those every 2 hours. That's fantastic. To be taken once every 2 hours. The other side had the well-known label of a Scotch distiller whose name modesty requires me to suppress. I think we can say your name was Jewish, wasn't it?
Can probably assume.
So, another interesting story. Another one, he was, you can see I'm reading this as well. So Jew and his friends went out to ball and they ended up in a bar, and they weren't really balling in the bar. They ordered some whiskey, and one of his friends was disgusted at the beastly small glasses, that they're serving our whiskey in. Yeah. So in 1998, what was it described as beastly small glasses? Dewar asked the barman to serve highballs in taller glasses. And newspaper coverage from that era apparently supports that, so it's not sort of an urban myth, it's fact. And in 1902, Dewars went so far as to trademark highball. So, yeah.
That's how it came about.
Yeah, it's... and today, any spirit combined with a carbonated mixer and served over ice in a tall 8-ounce glass can be called a highball. See, it's so much to thank Tommy Dewar for.
Yeah.
We've got the Moch's pictures.
Should we touch on
the homing pigeons?
No.
Do you know about the homing pigeons?
No.
So he was quite canny. By the way, he's a well-decorated man. He was Justice of the Peace for Kent, Lieutenant of the City of London, subsequently became Sheriff of London, the youngest Sheriff of London. It's not bad for a Scottish guy that came down to celebrate a whiskey. MP for Tower Hamlets, eventually, having failed the first time to get elected for the Conservative Party. And then became Baron Dewar of Holmestall in Sussex, and subsequently was the first ever whiskey baron. But in a nod to his character, witty, dapper and genial, but he's also a bit tight apparently, which, if you're successful in business, you have to watch the pennies. And he had a good friend, Sir Harry Lauder, who was a comedian of the age, of the day, and used to spend a lot of time at his fancy house, and was really keen on his pigeons. So he said, is there any chance I could have some of these pigeons to take back to Scotland with me? And Thomas duly sort of gave him some of these pigeons, but failed to mention that they were homing pigeons. So he didn't have them for very long before they were back in Tommy's house.
Well, he was a comedian indeed, yeah?
He didn't laugh when he lost his pigeons, I'm sure. And then they merged with one of their competitors, Stiller Company Limited.
With DCL, yes, that's right.
DCL.
That's right.
So this takes us all the way back to the Patterson brothers. So the Patterson brothers did, in a way, contribute towards the survival of whiskies
of the industry.
Even though they decimated it and destroyed everybody that was around them. And like we said, they can't be entirely blamed for the fact that everybody thought, they all jumped on the bandwagon. There was other people that were overproducing, using that to borrow. They're all at it. Yeah. But obviously, as we said, the Distillery Company Limited was able to buy up all these cheap assets, which enabled them to actually weather the storm during Prohibition and the Depression. And who was on the board? The two, John and Thomas Dewar on the board.
The two brothers.
The two brothers, not the bad brothers,
not
the good brothers, relatively good brothers.
See, we should have said that it's a story about four characters.
We should, yeah, but he was a bit of a dour one, apparently, John. Wasn't one for the limelight.
But he did do something very interesting, though.
Did he?
Yes. After they built Aberfeldy, so they built Aberfeldy basically to keep up with demands, another blending... Basically, the distillery was built with the purpose of, producing whiskey for blending purposes.
Yeah.
And what he asked the master distiller there, or the master blender, was to create the most constant blend on the market. Consistent. So a drink that just tastes the same regardless of how many bottles you're going to have or in which year or whatever it is. And he created basically what ended up becoming White Label. And that is the biggest selling Scotch whiskey in England and the US. And their tagline was, "It never varies." So that was basically, the master blender created exactly.
It never varies.
It was
inspired stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
It never varies.
It never varies.
So I just recalled, it's probably prompted by the fact it's written there, but I thought it was quite an amusing one, which is the one of his other less successful marketing tricks was to produce tyres that, as they revolved, this is great, as they revolved, would leave an imprint saying "Drink Dewars." So as a car drove past, you'd have a line of basically text saying, drink Jewers, drink Jewers, drink Jewers, drink Jewers, drink Jewers. I don't know how you'd measure the success of something like that. Apparently, I mean, I haven't seen, it's not something you see today. I'm sure there's laws against that, but I quite like that. I thought that was a great idea. And then his piece de resistance, admittedly, that may well have been the motion picture.
The motion picture, definitely.
TV advertisement, but also the illuminated sign over the wharf next to Waterloo Bridge, which at the time was the biggest illuminated sign, a mechanical sign as well, by the way.
Yeah.
So, and I, I'm always complaining about these tropes, and we're in a new time now where guys in sort of, kilts and tam o' shanties and raving claymores around isn't perhaps the way that we market whiskey today. But this thing employed 1,400 lights, 6 miles of electric cabling, and it was a big old dude with red hair and a kilt, pouring himself a dram and drinking it over and over and over and over again. Oh, this is a great little story that I found, and it was when he went to Canada. But whilst Canada was in the midst of prohibition, the US was in the midst of prohibition, Canada was considering it. So he went over there to sort of lobby people and generally just promote his brand. And some of the wild this is from his book, some of the wild teetotal papers took me rather severely to task because I had the temerity to send to the commissioners some statistics showing the average life of various classes of drinkers. It's fantastic. Amongst them being the total abstainers, who had the shortest average, and the habitual drunkard, whose average was 2 years longer. So, it's a long life, health and long life.